My name is Tom Cassdy. I'm known to the international correspondence or mail art, like things you send through the mail, known as Music Master, formerly Space Angel, and once as the Impossibilist. A lot of unusual names there. I was drawn to mail art or correspondence art when I was in college. I was visiting a girlfriend at California College of Arts and Crafts from Oregon, where I was living, to hear Michael McClure, the great old beat poet, teach English. And I thought, wow, that's going to be awfully bizarre for him to get a straight gig at a real school. And while I was at CCAC, in a student union, there was a man named Dana Atchley, the Ace Space Company, who had a van, and he was traversing America's underbelly, as he put it, documenting activities by artists that were way below the radar and certainly out of the range of what the museums were willing to accommodate at the time. And a lot of it involves early small press, underground press, a lot of performance, a lot of unusual activities. One woman had been documenting her own demise with 6 different things were killing her, and her artwork were the various charts and documents of that process. Others had created early versions of board games. Others did manifestos, poetry, performance, all this stuff, and I was intrigued by it. Much more so than I was by Michael McClure, though I did love him as well. And when I returned to Oregon, I took Dana Atchley's address with me, and years later, in fact, booked him at art events up in Portland. But when I got to Portland, I got the addresses for some of these people he had talked about, and I plugged into the earliest group of correspondence artists, kind of a central, you would say, who is sending out postcards? Who's doing crazy stuff? It was called General Idea in the Image Bank in Vancouver, BC. And they plugged artists into other artists via the mail system. And over a couple of years, I just started sending out postcards, images, ideas, pictures, little manifestos, things for you to add to and send back to me. And I was hooked. I just loved it. It seemed a way that it appealed to me because it separated me from the very powerful ego I have as an artist to have an alter ego and to assume an identity that to the broader community via the mail had no gender, age, profession, academic credential, essential background to what I did. I did what I did, and I liked doing what I did. And after doing it for months, I started amassing all this mail. And some of the people with whom I corresponded, that was in 1972, some of the people with whom I corresponded in the mid-70s, I still correspond with to this day. I have met a few of them. Over the years, I did a series of articles about them for different neighborhood papers, depending on where I was living. And it was interesting that when I would occasionally meet them, or go to another city and I can finally meet this guy I've been corresponding with in Cleveland all these years, it didn't sour the relationship, but it brought a type of reality that to me wasn't quite as exhilarating as just sending stuff out into the ether. I still did it, and many of those friends or friendships certainly survived those personal encounters. But to me, the thrill has always been similar to when you're a kid and you get something in the mail and it's a surprise. And whether it's a greeting card from grandparents with money inside, or you order 100 toy soldiers for $1 and you wait for the mailman to come. But this stuff was all unexpected. It was thick with 60s. Now, I don't want to say just radicalism, but idealism and wide open hope and things I had never thought of before. Marvelous artists, brilliant artists, artists who only worked on images of dirigibles, artists whose only interests were documents about Boy Scout jamborees. One guy ran for mayor of, I think, Toronto as Mr. Peanut. Wore the Mr. Peanut costume, tap danced to Pennies from Heaven, and got quite a few votes, but his correspondence activity was the document of that campaign. While all this was happening, there's a group that started, still around today, called the Bay Area Dadaists, and that was Anna Banana, Bill Gaglione, and a few others, who made it slightly more high profile because they would do things with the museums. I was not a museum type person, and I think by 75 or so, Rolling Stone did an article. It was kind of, look at this, there's these artists all around the world, by the way, and at that time, I think they guesstimated there were 10,000 active correspondents. When I was peaking in this activity in, say, 1990, there were a known 250,000 people doing it around the world. It has since settled quite a bit because now it's called snail mail. It's people are dismissive about it. A lot of the artists cared less about that thrill of waiting for the postman and instead just do things via email or Facebook. I don't really do either. I don't do Facebook. I do email with people, but it's not how I exchange art, and it's not how I like to receive art in the mail. So when I moved to Minnesota, I'd say 1980, I got a semi-corporate legit job, which I hold to this day, 35 years later. Had I gotten a job, I often say at Dairy Queen, I would still be a Dairy Queen. I've had little ambition in the real world. I want to make art. If I were still at Dairy Queen, I would make the best blizzard in the entire world. I like to think I make among the best mail art in the entire world. I'm not really sure. But to me, it was nice to get a job that, I could have a family and send kids to school and own a home. So that was the plus of all of that. So I benefited from it, but I do straddle very odd realities. The most anarchistic, subversive, Fluxus, Dada, Neo-Dada, modern art movements, including correspondence art, which represents in part all of those things ongoing, and a very regular desk job that I continue to this day.
Can you tell us a little more about how you got started? I mean, I don't know from what you said, sort of what the first piece of mail you sent out was, what it invited people to do, what came back. I mean, the picture of how this thing grew to be what it is today is still a little murky for me.
Yeah, and keep in mind that within, even at its peak, there's hundreds of little subgroups and groups about which I'm fully unaware, and major groups that have been historified. 3 major art history books have been put out about this movement already. And I resist that inclination because it creates a hierarchy. And you're after the same pursuit of deifying certain people who can go in the museum and and Ray Johnson invented mail and he's a god to all of us. I don't know that he did. I don't know that he cared that he did or that he was important to many of us. But there are histories of this now which I am resistant to. I don't like that. I've corresponded with and in writing about mail art, other people have never heard of and could care less about, and maybe they only corresponded with me. So if art is indeed what you like, it is certainly that's the case in mail art. You don't have to respond to anything you get, and when you send something out, Lord knows if it even gets there. If the mailman buries it or loses it, well, that's part of the magical process. So after meeting Dana Actually, who gave me the addresses of a couple of people, and he did a slideshow of the things that they did, I just did postcards and drawings and sent them out without any expectation. But I was not yet aware that it was a movement. There were people that looked interesting to me, and I was interested in non-traditional art. So I would send them things, and I don't know that they would be regarded as traditionally coherent. They weren't linear messages. I would always say, who are you? Nice to meet you. What do you do? But I'd send my little drawings of, well, I was at Mount Angel College at the time, so sketches of the nuns in the nun cemetery chasing the students around. I don't know what you had said at the time. But I would mail things out and hope that things would return. But the only people who had like a list, that you could get a list, there was no directory, and there isn't even to this day, though there is an International Union of Mail Artists, IUOMA, online. Everybody's on there. Hundreds of my pieces are on there. I'm not a member of it. I am not part of it. I don't contribute to it. I don't like the idea of a union. I don't like the idea of that type of organization. But there was never, even in the early days, any directory to go to. You would correspond with someone, and then in turn, they would send something, and they'd send your address to somebody else. And I don't know that it's the correct, but abiogenetic. It just appears. It just kind of happened, and this network sprung up. It was only years later that I was aware that there was, in fact, some history, legit or not, but some history or lineage into which I was entering at the time. I did little drawings about the campus where I was at school. And my name then, my alter ego then, was Space Angel. And it was a character with wings that was always flying into things. Trees, campus buildings, nuns. But yeah, it's funny to explain. I'm a very pro-chaos person. That with that, of course, you get that obsessive sense of organizing or ordering the chaos. And I did always try to stay on top of it, and I do too many things at once all the time. But even in that world, there was no way to rein it in. Many have tried, thus the history books. Many others have tried to do an international, celebration. Mail art shows in the 80s and 90s were happening in over 250 major institutions, meaning the big deal museums and galleries all around the world. And when people developed these lists out of the image bank or knew that you existed, remember, it's no email and no computer. They'd send out a postcard, and that would get forwarded to you, and somebody would put it on a copier. And remember, even then, we couldn't even afford copiers, let alone quick prints. That didn't roll in until like 1978. There was no postal instant print or any quick print. Unless you knew how to use the copier or could sneak away a copier at the school, you did everything by hand. And so people would start doing themes, and they'd say International Mail Art Show on Mountains. There was an Earth Show in Calgary where everybody was supposed to send a little packet of dirt from their backyard as a postcard, and they did some big healing ceremony in Calgary. And there were hundreds of these shows all the time. And though I still participate in some, that was not what drew me to the activity. In fact, I didn't like it when there was a theme or an anchoring idea. As nice as the ideas are, there's a Goombaya, it just doesn't appeal to me. I want to send what I want to send, and I want to get what people want to send me. So, not to get more rude on the subtext there, but I especially always dislike where they do, in the tradition of the Dadaists, the last mail art show, the death of mail art show, the burial of mail art, the end of all mail art, kill the correspondence artist. There were 10 of these damn things a year, and then this long-lived mail art. Well, whoopee, I got through that whole equation without wasting postage on you. So that became a preoccupying sense of the movement, and I think to the fault of the people who did the books, kind of defined what it was all about, and it certainly has never been about that. To me, it really is simply not a sophisticated form of having pen pals, but definitely a very aberrant form of having pen pals.
What was your correspondence like before you began thinking about it as art?
I didn't really do much correspondence. I'd been a school editor of the paper, editor of the college paper, so I did have a more journalistic sense of how I approach things, and even to this day I do. I try to stay on top of certain things that are going, but it's not how I usually express what I want to say in my art. I want to tear all that stuff apart and put it in a way that's no longer recognizable. So my correspondence, I didn't have pen pals in grade school or in high school. My thrill would be, getting suckered into getting postage stamp premiums from Littleton Stamp Company and, saving all my paper route money to buy a penny from the Cape Verde Islands. So it was very, not just traditional, but very, I was commercially suckered by it all. But still, that, to me, made the mailbox just a magical place, and seeing the mailman a very magical thing. I liked that something would come to your door and you didn't know from whence it sprang, even if you had ordered it. There's something on Boylston Street somewhere in another town where a guy packages stamps and sells them to you. So that was the commerce part, I guess, got me intrigued by what could happen through the mail. But when I was in college and thinking more anti-mainstream art, I'm not big on museums. I'm not big on celebrating and assigning millions of dollars worth of value to the art of the dead. Museums charge 20-some bucks to go in, and they're all excited because the corporation underwrites it, so one night a week you can go in for free. It should be free all the time. They have paintings nobody wants to see anymore that some corrupt oligarch in Russia will give them $1 billion for. The museum could be open up around the clock all the time. So I always dislike museums because of it. I like places where it's free and it's open and it's fully separate from commerce. So in mail art, even now, it's been around enough decades that there is the assigning of value. The guy I mentioned earlier, Ray Johnson, his pieces can go, a little Xerox piece, a card, a collage, could go from $50,000 to $250,000. and it looks no different than what I have in the binders in the front of this store right now. Though the man, he figures indifferently for what he did when and who's first. But, to me, no one's climbed Mount Everest until I get up there. Nobody stops breathing tomorrow morning because other people have been breathing before. No one has seen and understood the Mona Lisa until you look at the painting yourself. So, though I tend to get cynical and overwrought on some of these issues, I do always lobby for the genuine joy and enchantment of creativity and what could be there. And when so much of it is prepared and engineered in advance with rules. Oh, and so that's a big thing with the rules. So the mail art shows start coming rolling in all the time. And the big rule, the given rule I was willing to go along with to participate in these shows was no jury, no rejections, everything is shown, and everybody whose work is shown gets documentation. So in 2 weeks, when the mail art show comes down in this bookstore, eat my words, I will take everybody who sent me pieces to this show, and I'll do a cute little catalog with full color reproductions and everybody's name and address, and send it to them. So as you had asked earlier, how to get more names and addresses, suddenly they'll have a list of names and addresses who got involved in this show in Minneapolis. I'm sorry I lost my train of thought there. Where did I derail?
Well, I guess I'm coming at this conversation from an odd place. I mean, my family house is just in the process of being dissolved, which means that in my mother's car, which I also inherited, are boxes and boxes of correspondence, including the sympathy cards for my father's funeral and birthday cards from when I was 5. And the correspondence from when I was in Europe, and my parents felt a responsibility to write to me very frequently to kind of keep connected. And so, and I've read, and my question, and I pick up these pieces one at a time, and it's now possible to scan them, which means you can kind of preserve them even if the paper's lousy. But I read them and think, is this something I want to preserve? And one thing I learn is there's a tremendous amount of correspondence that people don't want, that I wouldn't preserve, because although certainly people felt obliged to send it, they were also it was also totally perfunctory.
Oh, sure.
And I read my own letters with this incredible sense of, now that these people are dead, couldn't I think of something better to say to them back when they were alive?
Oh, dear.
So I'm having this funny relationship myself to correspondence. And so was really interesting to me coming here today to think about somebody who was taking correspondence seriously in a way that I wish more people did, and a way that I've kind of resolved I'm going to do in the next 30 years or 20 years or 10 years I have left. So I'm coming at what you're talking about, thinking about not so much correspondensifying art, making art happen with mail, but artifying correspondence.
Well, you can collage anything, I would suppose. And keep in mind, in correspondence art, there's certainly no obligation to respond to anything, send anything to any show. Oh, and that was the point I wanted to make earlier. So there were these rules that I liked, everything would be shown, and then suddenly, after a few years, and after the Rolling Stone article, they'd announce there's this mail art show. And students would read about it, and you'd be inundated with mail that I wouldn't regard as having any content or any value. It was gratuitous. It was like a Hallmark card, and people were doing it so they could get art back. So there was some degree of commerce that they were after that I didn't feel existed in every exchange I was having. So I would just not participate, or many times, hundreds of times, I haven't responded to things if I didn't like them. And I think that's fair. I'd say the postman ate it or buried it or it never got to me. But that's interesting, the artifying of correspondence. I don't know that was ever correctly my intent. It was instead that it was so outside of the museum, and it has such a rich, genuine history of people connecting with one another on a personal level that even in the 70s to me was dying. I spent hundreds of hours in community ed classes. I taught classes at community ed for years and years and years, telling people to make their own greeting cards. I hate that people buy a greeting card. I hate that people, for the cost of a postage stamp and some hack, rhymey-dimey thing out of Kansas City, pretend that they really give a rat's ass about their relative. Better you should go to your mom's house and slap her in the face than send her a card you bought at the Hallmark store. I'm sorry, Hallmark. But that's how I felt. It's that hard to do an original thing. So a lot of my stuff, again, is often, not often, but occasionally rich and thick with sentiment and good intention and genuine connection. You send me a mass-produced thing, you do 100 things, and I spend 5 hours doing a collage and a letter and a poem and decorating the envelope with the chance it's going to get lost in the mail. So people came along and they did more and more, and they wanted to keep adding all these rules and all these protocols. And when the rules started to include not everything will be shown, I would never send to those people again. You just blew the ground rules. If there are ground rules, no censorship, everything is shown, no rejections, documentation to all. Open, egalitarian, free speech, what in my core I think art always should be. But commerce and history and all these things jab their way in, bully their way in on all sides. And I'm not fully, devoid of those influences. I've certainly done things with institutions, and I've been in shows that have been in museums and by invitation. But generally speaking, at night when doing correspondence, the real joy comes to making something for someone.
Well, I'm curious how you think about shows. I mean, even the good shows. I mean, I can imagine you pulling back a level and saying, I write letters to people.
Yeah.
I send postcards.
Mm-hmm.
I get postcards back. That's what I do.
Yeah.
End of story.
Yeah.
And it sounds like the question is, what's the first step that gets you, gets your foot in the trap?
Well, the best way to go, though I don't necessarily approve, but you could get involved this way and then not return to the site, would be through the International Union of Mail Artists online. There are other people who routinely do group shows, and the announcements and invitations to those can be found on Google. Wikipedia probably. When they first did a thing on mail art a number of years ago, it was penned by Vittorio Baroni, Carlo Pittori, and Ed Varney. Long-time correspondence people who active, maybe some before me, late 60s even. There was some definitely influence from the beatniks. And they actually sent that around to about 200 of us to read and review before, to be sure we were not sanctioning what they said, but that we were okay with what they said. That they weren't saying, this man invented postage, or this guy did the first mail art piece. John Bennett, my good friend with whom I've exchanged mail and have collaborated on many, many books as well since 1974, said the first mail art was the first letter mailed. And I do think to some extent that's true. You're making a connection without benefit of immediate interpersonal interaction. And so you're engaging symbols, which would be as simple as a picture of Mount Vernon on your field trip and you send that to mom. Or it could be some screwball painting or collage or whatever you want it to be. To me, there's not a huge disparity between the content or the effort of that communication. I just happen to prefer certain things over others, and everybody does.
I guess what I'm still wondering is your motivation for moving beyond just doing it to doing shows?
Yeah, I've done a lot of shows.
But I'm wondering why. I mean, why if your primary satisfaction is the exchange of letters, why take on the trouble and, in many cases, the compromises of doing a display?
Well, yeah. Well, I'm horrifically compromised all over the place because language gives you no other alternative. And I've been in many, many shows, and I was also often, maybe that's what you were asking earlier, but I wasn't understanding it correctly. I've had long exchanges with authors and with writers and with poets that might be more regarded as traditional letters or the exchange of ideas, but to me that was all fully independent of correspondence art. It was a different activity. I don't mind shows, and I put on shows like the one at the bookstore this month in Minneapolis, so that people and the stuff that came in the mail is all that we have in the window. I didn't populate it with stuff that's especially brilliant or intriguing or inflammatory, as much as I enjoy that kind of stuff. We put up what came, and people eyeball it, and I think it's eye-opening. This goes through the mail, this went through the mail, you got this in the mail, because I do find it exhilarating that people could look at it and at once not get it at all and fully understand it. It's right there. Yeah, it's odd that I'm optimistic about anything, but in art there's always hope, and in writing there's always hope, and in mail art and in writing and in poetry and all that stuff, there are always the outcomes that you shape and you strive for, whether real or imagined. You give them a voice and opportunity to, from which others, I think, can benefit, just from that energy. I've corresponded with some people. Would you mind if I mention two of them?
Yes, but
Russell Butler, who's sent to this show, lives in Gurdon, Arkansas. I've corresponded with him since 1975. He was originally called Hoo Archives, Hoohoo, and his icon, or his image on all of his letters, a rubber stamp, was like that curved Halloween cat from the 30s. And it was the image they had over his neighborhood movie theater where he grew up and went to the Saturday matinees. And he just liked it, so he called himself Hoo Archives. He quickly, I'd say by 1980, picked the name that he is to this day, and it's Buzz Blur. And what's interesting about this guy, and I love this guy's stuff, and they did a retrospective at Museum of Modern Art, and many of these people, there's no money in it, and when you get a show, it's not like you have something you could sell. You know, it's kind of, can I send it to you for free? No, I'm kidding. There's not a lot of money in it. But he is a brakeman on the railroad. He's retired now, and was a brakeman on the railroad for over 50 years. And he did what would now be called graffiti, but it was a very stylized icon of a head with a hat and a feather leaning into the wind. And he would draw it on the side of all the rolling stock, all the freight that went through the rail yards. And I did an article about him after he'd been doing it for years, and we tried to research different things, and apparently yardmasters all over North America would place bets on incoming trains how many times this icon would appear. He created the modern post-war Kilroy Was Here. He created an anonymous icon of this thing going all across America. Very few people knew he was behind it. I did, because he was also a correspondence artist, and he sent sticker sheets and of the different images he put. And after he did it for a while, if you corresponded with him, next week all of the train icons he do might have your name on it or your identity. So it would say Space Angel, or it would say from Minneapolis, or we're going up to Alaska. There was another guy, Kingdom of Edelweiss in North Carolina, and I don't know whatever became of him. He existed for about 10 years. My understanding is there's been quite a bit written about him. Again, I don't follow those websites where they do it. And he created Edelweiss. He created a whole country, and he made postage stamps, and he'd do like first day of issue. So an envelope from him was like first day of issue. And he'd draw these immaculate collectible postage stamps because he had just launched a new submarine and would have a banner on it. Or the team from Edelweiss just won the Olympics, and he'd have this commemorative stamp. And every 2 weeks you would get this big celebration going on in this country that was just him and his head at his table. It was staggering. Another guy, Joel Deese, I loved his stuff. He would take rubber stamps, which, by the way, were popularized. The big industry that came along with this scrapbooking and rubber stamping, none of that existed. Correspondence artists early on, you got rubber stamps from the feed store. I had stamps that were grade A, white only. You just stamp things and you play with them. Or you get throwaways from the post office. And then I'd say by the late 80s, early 90s, there was a whole rubber stamp industry, mostly founded by people who had come out of the correspondence art community. And a number of these artists would take those stamps, they'd make them, and they'd put them, I love this, they'd put it on the card, and they didn't stamp it, they'd put it on the card and they go, and you get this twisted head or these words just swirling around. And to me, and to this day, it's not as, I just don't correspond as much anymore. But my mailbox was a museum. I certainly didn't need places like the Walker. I'd go home and it was waiting for me. And what was better, I didn't know what was on the permanent collection in the Modern Art Gallery. It was going to change today. A lot of the people, and it's a lot of self-referential things. People would change their names, they'd change their addresses. But of course, over the years we've had, well, Greta Maddock lives here in town. He was one of my original correspondents, no longer active, but he's a Minneapolitan. But one guy was occupant, one guy was police forward, one guy was returned to sender, and these were their names above the address. So everybody had a good deal, and there was a magazine that lasted at least 10 years. By that I mean a little zine, you know, done on a duplicator and stitched, maybe 300 copies, full of content, people documenting this life. Many people have written zines only about what they've done in correspondence, what they got that month. I don't care what they got that month, but I correspond with a lot of these people. But my favorite was Laughing at the Postman, and there were always icons of Laughing at the Postman.
Sounds like great fun. I mean, I was there when my son discovered graffiti and zines. Well, let's see, when would that have been? You know, in the 90s. Mm-hmm. And, you know, all of these personae. And then there was this generation before that of, you know, in the early days of the internet, there were these cafes where people took on all sorts of strange identities and had elaborate, odd conversations in persona. I haven't seen so much of that anymore. I'm sure it's still out there, but you know, the energy of, you know, this incredible creative energy was out there.
Yeah, and it is, and it definitely was a key part of correspondence. We would often do events that were other types of performance art events, and we would usually include a mail art component, and then I would do shows. We're going to be doing this event a few days in Portland, send stuff in, and we'll hang it up. And it is both eye-opening and reassuring. There's something genuinely wonderful about it, and I've stuck with it so long. And at Minnesota Center of Book Arts 2 different times over the past 20 years. I've done exhibitions there of magazines that came out of correspondence art, and there's hundreds of them. And some that, given lack of budget, so these people were on the, you know, the grant dole to get the money to do perfect bound, glossy, beautiful, full color publications. There were some of those, but it is remarkable, the range of content, and especially the extreme talent represented in these publications that are very, they're in the rarefied, esoteric air, but not, at last, in a book room you can't enter, or in the domain only of the ivory tower or the academic, but in a place where you could get it and be part of it and see it and participate and contribute yourself. I love when there's a chance to do that type of show.
I did a bunch of interviews a few years ago with the Women's Art Institute St. Kate's, and these are women who've, a lot of cases, have been painting or sculpting or something their whole lives in some back room of their suburban home. And finally they get an opportunity to take a month and just do art and get some critique and get some commentary. Mm-hmm. And I think about my mother, who was multiply gifted and ended up doing a lot of little things. What do you take the decision to be? I mean, if I find myself outgushing with artistic ideas and wanting to try something, how does one think about whether to try to be, you know, to take that as being a painter and fighting with the other painters, or doing correspondence art and getting, you know, immediate satisfaction from one's own mailbox?
Well, right. That to me, that's very gratifying. For most people, it isn't. But I'm also a performer, and I've been involved with different performance activities for years and years and years. in Fringe and Cheap Theater and Patrick's Cabaret and a monthly storytelling series I'm still a part of. And I like to do kind of stand-up funny, a type of slam poetry, though it's not traditionally slam poetry. And it is true that there's a thrill and there's more to risk to get in front of an audience where you could die in a way that's differently humiliated than if someone gets your postcard and throws it away and you don't even know if they ever got it. So it's a very different risk. And I don't know that it's safer because you attach to it the same expectation. You're hoping somebody gets it and likes it and gets back to you. The audience is always suspect because you're always going to get the golf clap even if you really suck, especially in a literary community. And I hosted open mics for over 25 years in 3 different venues, often weekly. And I calculated that I've heard over 12,000 different performers. Do you know how many bad poets and god-awful folk singers I have heard in my life? And yet I would sit through and endure 100,000 more over primetime television, in that there is that humanity there of somebody, even if they fail, getting the balls, the confidence to stand up and try and at long last express themselves outside of the protocol and the niceties of common conversation. Hey, how you doing? Let's lunch. Yeah, good to see you. It's just this vapid literal chatter we live in, and with benefit of social media, it's exploding. There's no connection there. You don't need to know anything. You check it on Google. You check it on Wikipedia. You have no more journalists really working out there. So to find a real connection takes a little bit of effort. And I think in the art community, and I often am in shows and I even book people I don't especially like. But that's my other head, like my real world job. Like that I don't like them doesn't mean that what they have to impart, what they say, their version of poetry and art might benefit more of the audience than what I have to say. So the trick is, I try to balance a program that in my head, when booking or curating a show, has a mix that will connect with the most people in as broad a way as possible. So getting along with other artists is always a challenge to me, and I do not like that I said that where anyone would hear me saying that. But yes, it's a challenge because of you. No, I love you.
Oh, dear. Well, I mean, part of what I was wondering is whether these housewives I met at the Women's Art Institute, who were so proud that they'd finally done big canvases and they had a show and so forth. I can imagine somebody saying, "Look, if I'd gone the correspondence art route, I never would have actually got on a stage. I never would have actually put it on a wall. I would have never taken it public." Mm-hmm. And I might be, kicking myself about that.
Oh, I doubt it. I mean, I don't know of anybody in correspondence art who regrets having done that instead of pursuing opera. The disciplines are so profoundly different. And remember, there's definitely an isolated, individualistic feel to being a correspondence artist. It does not need community for it to happen. I've corresponded with people in the Arctic Circle and at the southern tip of Peru, the people who live in the middle of nowhere and probably never see anyone but the postman. So yeah, how the gratification is a bit different, certainly aesthetically. I love going to see art shows. I love going to theater. I love listening to poets, even poets I don't like. And that, I don't know how to correctly explain that, like when I was talking about hosting open mics so long. But if in retrospect there were a positive contribution I've made in the arts, it would be the open mics. It's completely under the radar, underpaid, underappreciated, but it was a real sense of creating community in coffee shops before Starbucks rolled in and destroyed it all. There was some charm. There was something you got together and you just didn't open up a computer and ignore everybody around you to write the great American novel. And let me make one other comment about art in general. It used to be people would say I could write a book, and alas, the sorry fact is nowadays they do. And I'd advise against it. Send a postcard instead. You'll only annoy one person if they don't like it. And who knows, you might get a friend for life.
Yeah, I like that. I think it's Flannery O'Connor who said, when people said, well, writing teachers, squelch all sorts of budding writers, and her response was something like, "That's their job."
yeah, please be more heavy-handed.
And so I can kind of see. I mean, this is a niche for somebody who probably shouldn't write a novel, who shouldn't do Bruegel room type show someplace, to do something that makes sense in its own terms and provides satisfaction in its own terms and is in fact part of the spectrum of artistic activity.
It is curious in a way that many people have participated in it who, out of genuine interest, I admit, but accidental connection or doing an interview myself many years ago, turn out that they're heart surgeons or they're plumbers or they're or bona fide big deal artists like Ray Johnson was, and it didn't matter, it didn't affect what he said. But a lot of the people in the happening community in the mid to late 50s, Alan Capro, Charlotte Moorman, other people like that, Yoko Ono, did correspondence art. It was just another way for a performance or an activity. A lot of the cards that were sent then, and some people still send it to this day, are instructions, in fact, or a little score for you to perform in the privacy of your home. And they would send that to you. And the art would be completed when you would respond and say, yes, we performed it. And I'm sure somewhere they have a log. My piece for the living room was performed 15 times in New Jersey in the past 20 years, so maybe not a big audience, but there's definitely, to say it's idiosyncratic and eccentric is as fair to say what I like best about it. It is insanely unnecessary. It is art for art's sake. Art for art's sake is art. Art for art's sake is art that has to happen, regardless of restrictions, rules, parameters, affiliation, concern, careerist ideas, anything. It has to happen. I cannot go home, and Dawn will tell you this, and not do art tonight. It simply will not happen. That will happen the night I get home and die before I get to the table. I do art. It's what I do. And in and of itself, I like it. And maybe it's, the devil's playground. If I didn't do it, I'd be doing horrible things. I don't really know. But to me, there's a fulfillment in sending it out and getting it to other people. And I certainly get so much more back in response since doing it. In my personal archives, I have 40,000 pieces of mail from artists, poets, writers, zine producers around the world. And at my age now, and this is happening globally with my generation of correspondence artists, many hundreds of us who no longer do the volume we used to do, there's a movement called getting rid of your archive. What are you going to do with it? And many people are juggling. To which university do we send it? How do we pass it along? Do we cherry pick it and pick out stuff that we like? If I give it to Michael Basinski in Albany, or if I give it to Jeff Rathermill at Minnesota for the Book Arts, is he just going to pull the people that, because of the history books, are regarded as important? So everybody has these rules. Yes, you can have it, but you have to take it all. You have to keep it all. On the other hand, I'm very reticent about sharing my archives with those who will not share it. I want it to go to a place where people could feel free to handle it, look at it, and I'd say even collage on it, though I don't think many archivists would let that happen.
Yeah. I'm curious. I've been thinking about that. I just got a double-sided scanner, which allows me to begin thinking about producing archives of things in a way I couldn't before because the storage was just too insane. And I'm trying to think about, and I mean, I'm getting to the age where I know a bunch of people who probably need to be more famous than they are, and who have stuff in their closets that's pretty interesting. That somebody will either intervene and say this is interesting and needs some attention, or no, this gets thrown, this gets burned. And it'll happen more or less without much thought for a lot of these folks. Now, my question is kind of, how do you see archives being used? I mean, do you go to archives? Do you know if somebody leaves behind their 40,000 pieces of correspondence art?
Yeah, no,
do
I
you
don't
go
bother.
there and paste it?
No, unless
you know?
they mail it to me, I'm not going to look at it.
And do you think anybody will? Do you think what do you think will happen if you find a university that will sign off on every condition you want to leave
Yeah.
for your stuff and make a special room with your name on it?
Yes, that's
for,
really all I want. But it can't be my real name.
What'll happen? What do you imagine happening to it?
Well, I have indeed thought of, I don't like the cherry picking, I would cherry pick it myself. I would go through with a critical eye and my sense of which would most represent what I did these many decades, would cut it in half with no problem. There's Scott Helms, who is right here at Eat My Words and helped us with a recent festival here in town, and I've corresponded with him since 1978. He's a big deal concrete poet. And he had the largest rubber stamp collection in the world. He started in the 70s, and he has rubber stamps that include the sets made in the 1880s and 90s for rural communities where there weren't duplicators or way to make copies, and so teachers would stamp the coloring pages for kids to color in the chicken and the house and the train and all that stuff. And he had tens of thousands of these things. And another guy, part of the Bay Area Dadaists, back when I first got involved in correspondence art, named Bill Gaglione, known now as Picasso Gaglione, tried over these years with Scott Helms. They were correspondents in the mail art scene. They decided he was going to go up against Helms for getting a bigger rubber stamp collection. So here you have 40-some years of these guys who, Scott's an architect, and Gaglione on and off would get money, but they did it at thrift stores, garage sales, estate sales, and they amassed this ridiculous collection and have done many shows over the years. They put together, between the two of them, a collection that should be in the Smithsonian. It is unrivaled in scope, so you have from those rural stamp sets that are over 100 years old to the A-team. So you have Mr. T with the kitten. But every alphabet, every image, and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands of hand-carved stamps made by artists with razors on rubber stamps or on soft linoleum. And they have the archive. And they just, beginning of this year, together donated it all to Minnesota Center for Book Arts. And I believe this fall will be the opening, and it is going to be an operating interactive archive. And there's a money component involved where there's interns right now sorting and assembling and organizing it in storage, where you will be able to go in and use those rubber stamps. So that is, granted, very unusual. I'm thinking that because Minnesota Center for Book Arts has made some headway into understanding the broader idea of what a book is. And that's why I totally love MCBA, because that's how I understand the book. I'm a book collector. I'm a book-obsessed person. I love books. But I think mail art has changed the way I consider what a narrative is, what a chapter is, what a message is, what a poem, a story. Everything I know about visual poetry, concrete poetry, non-traditional, non-linear poetry, I didn't know it when I was doing it, was because of those early years of correspondence art. I didn't think of it that way, but I clearly over the years haven't narrowed my focus, but have been more selective with whom I correspond, and it tends to be things that involve the language, or a fragmentation of the language, or shifting linear thought to a different way of understanding the language. So I'm thinking that if I cherry pick my own archive over the next few years, I would give it to MCBA, because they would find a way where people could in fact see it and use it.
Yeah. I'm curious about what getting better looks like for you as you do this over the years. Do you feel like you get better? Or do you feel like you are more centrally doing what you want to do? Or, I mean, what's the level, what are the dimensions of progress as you go through this stuff?
Well, it's a good point. There's definitely people who have just wailing away, flogging the same dead horse since 1970, and they send me the same
Probably
damn
dead
piece
horse
They've
productions.
just been doing it forever, and it doesn't change. I have, I peaked probably 1975, and it's just been all a sputtering downhill spiral, giving in to the paper getting old and fraying away. I shift my focus quite a bit. So I don't know that there's a measurable evolution in terms of quality. What I do is I don't see as well as I used to. So that's defined a little bit of a bias nowadays to collaging, which is easier for me to see. And I do a lot more writing, and I do a lot more almost traditional chapbook type of output. Though I love the nonlinear and the avant-garde and the fragmented poems that if you read them would go like that on the paper, my stuff is pretty much short stories about my family. And they're humorous and they have odd tangents, but I really write pretty traditional, not quite essays and not quite short stories, but something like that, a stand-up poetry version of that stuff. So on one hand, this journey into what is really a very marginal and avant-garde community is again the balance of my art life and my work life. On the other side, leading me, when I do perform in front of an audience, to try and communicate with as broad an audience as possible, and not like in mail art where it's a very specific and very narrow and very esoteric market. Well, it's not even a market. Group of recipients.
Now, when you started this way of spontaneously making a relationship with another person over time through exchanges of the sort, I mean, the mail was the only game in town.
Yeah.
Except, unless you were a ham radio operator, and I don't imagine that those guys tended to go in the artist direction.
Mm-hmm. No.
But now, among the competition is really the various sorts of creative blogs and video logs and so forth that people are doing. And I suppose, I don't know that the thrill of getting a letter is any less than it was. It's probably greater than it was in 1971.
Yeah.
In a funny way, because you get almost entirely junk in your mailbox.
Right.
But I'm wondering how you think about the mail component of what you're doing. Is there something really essential and important about doing this kind of work through the U.S. mail?
Well, to me there is, and to many people there aren't. I'd say by mid-90s, hundreds of people just fell off the radar. They just went to a blog. They went to a Facebook thing or whatever the version was then, and they could put everything up. And this, to me, is no longer personalized. To me, it's just chatter and noise, and it's nice, and some of it's good. And the Walker shows kitty videos to get you in, so you could look at your phone when they're not showing your kitty video. So instead of creating broader community, I think it does quite the opposite. So the thing, Warhol, that you'll be famous in 15 minutes, he got it totally wrong. You're going to be famous for 10 seconds and nobody's going to be watching. So the joy and the charm of mail is definitely dying. It's a narrow and increasingly smaller community. Many of the people, if not all, with whom I still correspond, have blogs and have websites and have big Facebook presences. And you go there and you can find 100 galleries of 100 people and all of their 40,000 pieces of mail. And my head is cluttered with stuff, and I don't know that I want everybody else's head clutter. Like, I give you as much clutter as is necessary to answer your questions, but I'm not going to make you go and look through the 40,000 pieces of mail or make judgment for you to appreciate what I think is going on in there. So it's wonderful, and I love, I did Access TV with MTN for a number of years, and I like doing that too. I do like the idea of personal interaction. I do like the idea of non-traditional broadcast interaction. I do like the idea when people get cameras and make their own shows. I do like stuff that isn't broadcast. I do like the idea that people are citizens and they're not merely consumers. That what we produce isn't just a commodity to be hustled into something. Maybe I can sell you a rubber stamp version of my mail art, but that it is something that is just genuinely offered in the way communities really build.
Hmm. You mentioned early on that you think that when you started all this, you were starting it with a persona, with an alter ego.
Yeah.
And that's a pretty common way that people interact. since what seems to matter to you is quality of relationship through this, in your judgment, does the correspondence you've engaged in this mode, build relationships that matter to you?
Well, they matter to me, but not in the way that most relationships matter to most people. I've definitely had long correspondence art communications with people that soured for reasons that would seem preposterous to other people. You know, content or ideas not working, or, you know, you finally found you're grokking with the entity in France over how to view a certain thing, and they don't take it the same way, and so, I'm never going to write to him again. That sort of thing. But it's a different type of relationship. I've had very strong friendships with people via the mail, and I would regard, honestly, as my best friends would be correspondence artists, and in many cases, some of my very good friends are people I've never met.
And has that happened while people sort of stayed within personas and alter egos?
Yeah, that was funny when I came to Minnesota, and this is like 1980, 81, and I continued to use the name Music Master, which I use to this day. Minnesotans don't like the alter ego thing. And somebody found out we were Tom Cassdy, and so they addressed you as Tom Cassdy, and you just got a lot of it. Now I think it's because of that damn International Union of Mail Artists, where somebody puts his real name is, what is this, Inside Edition for correspondence art? There's nothing on this planet that can't be sleazed out with, like, look at these facts. He works in an office. He has a real job. He's a disgrace to artists. You know, people are just really petty pains in the ass, and the fewer I know in person, the better off we all are, huh? No, so it is funny, but different people bring different standards and expectations and requirements, and as very representative with the shows when they change the rules, and suddenly we're going to jury a show, and suddenly it's by invitation only. I don't want to be invited. I don't want to be in the show that's by invitation only. I want to raid that show.
Well, one of the things I like best about Minnesota, maybe it is the thing I like best about Minnesota, is the number of people who are willing to sacrifice pretty much everything to do what they want to do. The theater community, I used to document the Fringe, and those guys, they don't tell you what their day job is, because it would bore you silly just to hear, but their life begins at 4. When they get off, and they have a full second life. Yeah. And my favorite artist in the world lives in Windham, Minnesota, and runs the Hallmark store, would you believe? And he is totally compulsive. He is totally, sure. I mean, he does nothing else. But, you know, his stuff is on every wall in Windham. And he's a real one. He's driven. Now you've had the experience of a real job that provided real money and a lot of side gigs in a lot of different areas.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
How's that working out for you? How has that worked out for you?
Well, it's been fine. I'd say, because I perhaps am more serious about art than I am about the job I do every day, and I do well, by the way, for 35 years, that my bigger disappointments are often in art. And you get involved, and I was in Fringe for years and years and years, either producing, performing, or helping, or doing signs or programs or volunteering, and hundreds, honestly, literally, and I don't incorrectly use the word literally hundreds of shows in this town. And sometimes I guess I'm disappointed that many artists, to their discredit, don't do art in the name of a broader community. That the ego, and I have as big an ego as anybody, but when the ego is the only pivot they have, And if it's only for their own benefit, and if they can't contribute to other shows, if they can't be willing to share a stage, if they can't bother to listen to the other artists, I do not like working with them. So my disappointments in art groups and in shows over the years, and remember, there's so many of them, it's not consequential, but my big disappointments have been with other artists who really don't care about other people. But look at these guys talk about those who do that which possibly shouldn't be done without benefit of dollar, but Vern Gagne is on here. But Baron von Raschke and all the local wrestling scene, I always love that. I love that stuff.